I did my best to pick verses from Memorial Day. After I read the scripture reading, I'm going to invite Roy up to the pulpit. I know this is a day that means a lot to him, and I believe he wants to share that with us. So, John chapter 15, verses 9 through 16. I have loved you just as the Father has loved me. So remain faithful to my love for you. If you obey me, I will keep loving you, just as my Father keeps loving me because I have obeyed him. I have told you this to make you as completely happy as I am. Now I tell you to love each other as I have loved you. The greatest way to show love for friends is to die for them. And you are my friends if you obey me. My servants don't know, some servants don't know what their master is doing. So I speak to you as my servants. Not so. I don't speak to you as my servants. This translation trips me up every time. I am so used to a different translation. Okay, servants don't know what their master is doing, so I don't speak to you as servants. I speak to you as my friends, and I have told you everything that my Father has told me. You did not choose me, I chose you and sent you to produce fruit, the kind of fruit that will last. Then the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. So I command you to love each other. Amen. Okay, Roy?
Morning, folks. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Pastor Tom for allowing me the opportunity to give today's message. I'd also like to thank Jim Hampton for his technical expertise in putting this presentation together, and also Liz Utter for her work on the list of gratitude, which is found in your in the bulletins. This ingratitude list lists American patriots who gave the last full measure of devotion, those who died that we may live, that our country may live, starting from the American Revolution on through the Vietnam War. I would ask that you remember them often, not just on Memorial Day, but throughout the year. And also keep in mind that no one ever really dies until the last time their name is spoken. Over the last 15 years, those of you who have heard my presentations hopefully have discerned one overriding theme, and that is the theme of divine intervention. Throughout the 250 years history of our great country, time after time, when our forefathers and foremothers were faced with adversity, when times were tough, when all hope seemed to be lost, the good Lord interjected himself and saved the day. Whether in the snowy fields of Valley Forge or at the angle of a stone wall on a hot summer July day in Gettysburg in 1863, or in the skies over Midway Island during World War II, within the short space of 5 minutes, American dive bombers turned what looked to be probable defeat into an astounding victory when they sank 3 Japanese aircraft carriers and seriously damaged the 4th. Make no mistake about it, God was there and God is with us today. All we have to do is ask for his help, and he'll be there for us. I was going to write this speech out, but it's just too emotional, so I'm going to let it rip. Hopefully you'll understand. Today, I'm going to talk about two instances that occurred during the War of 1812. Just as the Korean War is referred to as the forgotten war of the 20th century, the War of 1812 is often referred to as the forgotten war of the 19th century. But make no mistake about it, it was an important event because it was our second war of independence. Just to give you a background before I start the message proper, less than 30 years after the American colonies won their independence in 1783, the British Crown and British government were seeking to reincorporate the former 13 colonies back into the British Empire. And to do this, for starters, they hired some agents to work along the American frontier. And the American frontier this time wasn't the Wild West, it was the area of the Ohio River Valley, extending down through eastern Tennessee, through the Carolinas, and into Alabama and Mississippi. These agents were to work to stir up the Native American tribes against the American expansion and to hinder it. More egregiously, British warships intercepted American commercial vessels on the high seas in an effort to disrupt the American foreign trade. And when they would come aside of an American ship, they would board the ship and Shanghai American sailors, American-born sailors, and take them aboard the British ships to serve as British seamen. This went on for a few years, but by 1812, President James Madison and the American Congress had had enough, and they decided to declare war on the British Empire, which in itself showed quite a bit of moxie, because at that point in time, the American Army consisted of less than 15,000 troops, and the American Navy was comprised of 8 fighting vessels. This meager force going up against the greatest army and navy in the world. The main thing the Americans had going for them was that the British were preoccupied in Europe fighting a gentleman by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte, and the preponderance of their army and navy was dedicated to fighting him. Otherwise, the War of 1812 would have been over before it got started. So today, I'm going to talk about 2 instances that occurred in the latter part of the War of 1812. Actually, 2 instances that occurred in 1814. Now, our story begins in the city of Baltimore, in the home of a widow by the name of Mary Pickersgill. Mary was a noted seamstress, and her occupation was sewing together flags and banners. Beside the city of Baltimore is a large fort by the name of Fort McHenry, and it was built to protect the city of Baltimore. The commander of Fort McHenry in the spring of 1814 knew that Baltimore was on the British hit list, and it was just a matter of time before they attacked the city. And to this end, the commander, Major Armistead, contracted with Mary Pickersgill to sew together a large American flag which measured 30 by 42 feet. He wanted a flag so large that it could be seen for miles around. And note to all that could see it that yes, Fort McHenry was indeed American and would remain American. So Mary Pickersgill and her staff of seamstresses started the flag in her home, but with time it grew so large that they had to move it to a warehouse which was immediately adjacent to her home. Again, the flag measured 30 by 42 feet, and the canton, the blue part of the flag, contained 15 stars, since 2 states had been added since the Revolutionary War ended. Just to give you an idea how big this flag was. Each of those stars measured 2 feet across. So while Mary was busy constructing the stars and stripes, let's travel 50 miles to the southwest to the city of Washington, D.C. It's the middle of August 1814, and a large fleet of British invasion ships had assembled and were anchored in the Chesapeake Bay. And their intention was to offload thousands of troops that were aboard the ship and have them march on to the newly established American capital of Washington, D.C., and capture it and perhaps burn it. So the British troops were disembarked and they marched on to Washington. Along the way, they ran into a hastily defended American defensive force at Bladensburg, Maryland. But unfortunately, the Americans were outmanned, outgunned, and outflanked. In a short period of time, this defensive line melted away, leaving the road to Washington wide open. While this was being done, the American president, James Madison, took it upon himself to mount a horse and ride throughout the countryside, trying to rally the Americans to come back and defend their capital. While he was riding about the countryside, his wife, Dolly Madison, had a large wagon pulled up in front of the executive mansion. At that point in time, the home of the president was called the Executive Mansion. The term White House came into use many decades later. And it was Dolly Madison's job, which she took upon herself, to collect the irreplaceable valuables that were contained therein and place them in the wagon and drive them out of town so they would not fall into the hands of the British. And included in these archives was the life-size portrait of George Washington, which was painted by the renowned painter Gilbert Stuart, which was cut out of its frame and rolled up like a rug and placed in the wagon. So here's the scenario. You had the British marching into Washington, D.C. on one end of town. On the other end of town, Dolly Madison's driving her wagon full of the archives of the White House out, and the President of the United States ignominiously is riding about the countryside trying to rally the troops to come back and defend their capital. The first thing the British did when they came into the city of Washington, D.C., the officers marched into the former home of the American president and held a mock trial. And at that point, they decided that they would take action to burn the city to the ground the next day. As the next day dawned, they were true to their word, and they began torching the American Capitol, starting with the two symbols of the American government, the Capitol building and the Executive Mansion. And then God made his appearance on what started out as a crystal clear day. Out of nowhere, dark clouds rolled in, covering the heavens to the point where the day seemed to be almost like night. Lightning streaked across the face of the heavens. It was like a chapter taken out of the Old Testament where the Israelites were about to do battle with the Philistines. And then, for the first time in recorded history, never before that day and never since that day, but on that day, at that hour, a tornado hit Washington, D.C. And not just one tornado, but a swarm of tornadoes. Hurricane force winds whipped through the streets of the city, picking up British horses and troops and scattering them about, much like an angry child throws his toys about during a temper tantrum. 3,000-pound cannons were overturned along with their caissons. The British must have felt that the sword of Gideon was about to descend upon them, which in fact it was. And then the heavens opened up and torrential rains cascaded down from the heavens, quickly extinguishing the fires and so soaking the other wooden structures throughout the town that setting them afire was an impossibility. By this time, the British finally realized that they were up against a force far superior to any American ragtag army that could have been assembled. They hastily gathered together their men, their equipment, and beat a hasty retreat back along the road from which they came, back to their ships, waiting in Chesapeake Bay, ready to move on to their next objective, which was the city of Baltimore. American couriers on horseback quickly mounted their horses and rode to Baltimore, bearing the news of what had happened to Washington, and alerted the citizens of Baltimore and the defenders of Fort McHenry that, yes, the British were on their way. By this time, Mary Pickersgill had completed her flag and had presented it to Major Armistead, who proudly flew that flag from a large flagpole which was located in the parade grounds of Fort McHenry. It didn't have long to wait before the British showed up. Just prior to the British showing up, at that point in history, the town of Baltimore, even though it was inland, was considered a seafaring town. And it had a large cadre of American ship owners living in Baltimore who owned merchant ships stationed there. And these patriots sacrificed their livelihood by having their merchant ships sail into the main channel of the Patapsco River, which flowed past the city of Baltimore, had them intentionally sunk so as to create an artificial barrier beyond which the British fleet could not advance. In due time, the British ship showed up, and as one observer would later relate, the masts and the spars of the ships of the invading fleet were so plentiful that it looked as if a forest of trees were moving upon the face of the waters. That's how plentiful the British ships were. The British commander sailed as far as he could up the channel of the Patapsco River and finally came to the artificial barrier and had to anchor. His first objective was to have a truce to come up with a exchange of prisoner agreement with the Americans, because held in the bows of the British ships were hundreds of American prisoners of war, and it was the intention of the British commander to effect a prisoner exchange on a one-for-one basis because British prisoners were being held in Fort McHenry. And to this end, the British commander allowed a young American lawyer by the name of Francis Scott Key, who was a resident of Georgetown, to come aboard and work on this agreement of prisoner exchange. Negotiations went on for 2 or 3 days, and after a while, the British commander decided this is futility. Why are we negotiating when I have all this firepower behind me? I can pound Fort McHenry into submission. I can capture the city of Baltimore. The war will be over, and the prisoners that I now have will once again become British subjects. So at this point in time, he gave the order for all the British ships to open fire on Fort McHenry. Unfortunately for Francis Scott Key, in a way, he became a prisoner in his own right because he could not disembark and go ashore. He had to remain on the ship at the railing of the commander's flagship and witness the stupendous fireworks display that was about to take place. Included in the British Armada were rocket ships and bomb barges. The rocket ships fired Congreve rockets, which was a British invention, which was invented by a British artillerist by the name of William Congreve about 1800. And basically, the Congreve rockets looked like the bottle rockets that we shoot off on the 4th of July, but these were much bigger, standing perhaps 15 to 20 feet in height. They consisted of a metal canister of rocket propellant, which was strapped to a long wooden pole, which served as a primitive guidance system, but which in fact rendered the Congreve rocket completely aerodynamically unstable. And aboard, atop the canister of rocket propellant, was a large explosive shell or bomb. And in operation, you lit the fuse to the bomb, you lit the fuse to the rocket. Hopefully, the rocket fired before the bomb went off. The rocket would assume a high arc trajectory over the fort. It would explode, creating an immense, brilliant illumination, and the shrapnel from the exploding bomb would rain down on those inside the fort. In similar fashion, the bomb barges were just that. They had heavy mortars, which fired bombs, some weighing as much as 200 pounds, had a range of about a mile. The bombs would fly up and over the fort, would explode either just above the ground or on the ground, and again, send fragments of red-hot shrapnel in all directions. So this bombardment began and lasted for 25 hours. From time to time, the winds would part the enormous cloud of smoke that had enveloped Fort McHenry. And Francis Scott Key could observe that, yes, the American flag was still flying over Fort McHenry. And when he saw this, many times he would go below decks to console the American POWs that were being held in the brigs below deck. And their only questions were, how goes the fight? Can you still see the flag? Does the flag still fly? And this was done several times throughout the night. In another instance of divine intervention, inside Fort McHenry was a brick structure called the powder magazine, in which was stored 250,000 pounds of black powder. Sometime during the night, a 200-pound British bomb came crashing through the roof of that structure and landed in the midst of all that gunpowder. Had it exploded, Fort McHenry and half of Baltimore would have been wiped off the face of the earth. But through God's intervention, that bomb did not fire. It was a dud, thereby saving the fort. Throughout the night, as the bombardment continued, as the rockets were glaring, the bombs were bursting, from time to time, the cloud of smoke hanging over Fort McHenry would part. And Francis Scott Key could again see, yes, in fact, the flag was flying. But in the middle of the night, he noticed that the flagpole from which that flag was flying, and the flag was taking a terrible beating because it was becoming holed and shredded and torn. But now the flagpole from which it flew was being pitched at a precarious angle, as if it was ready to fall down. With the dawn's early light, again, the winds parted the pall of smoke which hung over the fort. And Francis Scott Key's heart jumped out of his chest when he could again see that, yes, the flag was still flying over Fort McHenry, and yes, the fort was still in American hands. The British commander saw this also, and having expended over 2,000 bombs and 800 Congreve rockets without effect, decided that the bombardment was a failure, and he ordered his ships to weigh anchor, turn about, and sailed back down the Pataska River in defeat. But before he sailed away, he allowed Francis Scott Key to disembark, at which point Francis Scott Key hastened to the gates at Fort McHenry to check out the damage. Upon entering the fort, the question that so piqued his curiosity throughout the night, how did that flagpole remain standing, albeit at such a precarious angle, was answered. For at the base of that flagpole lay a mound of wounded, dead, and dying Americans. American patriots who answered the call of an American president 150 years in the future. Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. As was explained to Francis Scott Key, these patriots, fully aware of the dangers they were exposing themselves to, rushed out and with their bare hands held that flagpole up until they were cut down. And as they were cut down, more of their brother patriots rushed forward to pull their bodies away and lend their hands to helping keep that flagpole aloft. Francis Scott Key was so impressed with what he saw because 4 days ago, he was against the war. It really didn't mean that much to him. But having witnessed the bombardment of Fort McHenry, having seen the sacrifices of the American patriots, the patriotism that dwelt within his heart came forward. He put pencil to paper and started writing down the lines of a poem, which started out, Jose, can you see? By the dawn's early light. Soon, print shops throughout Baltimore were pumping out hundreds of copies of Francis Scott Key's poem, which he entitled The Defense of Fort McHenry. 4 months later, the War of 1812 ended when General Andrew Jackson's ragtag army of regular soldiers, frontiersmen, Native Americans, freed slaves, and Jean Lafitte's river pirates banded together to totally annihilate the British Army on the plains of Chalmette, just outside of the city of New Orleans. The war having been won, the patriotic fervor that swept across the country, print shops in cities, towns, and villages up and down the East Coast began pumping out thousands of copies of Francis Scott Key's poem, which by this time was renamed The Star-Spangled Banner. And in keeping with the times, since every good poem needed a song to go along with it, ironically, the Americans adopted a British tavern song by the name of To an Anacreon in Heaven, a song which British soldiers used to drink their grog to in the swill shops of England. Soon the Star-Spangled Banner, both words and tune, became the unofficial national anthem of Americans both North and South, and it continued on up until the advent of the Civil War. With the Civil War, the Star-Spangled Banner became a rallying call for Union troops fighting to save the Union and to free an oppressed people, while those in the South adopted such patriotic songs as Dixie and the Bonnie Blue Flag as their anthems. But after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, the country reunited, The Star Spangled Banner again became the unofficial anthem of the Americans, which carried our country through the Spanish-American War of 1898 and World War I. But it was not until 1933 when, by an act of Congress signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, did the Star Spangled Banner become the official national anthem of the United States of America. And so we close the story of Mary Pickersgill and her flag, the heroics of President James Madison and First Lady Dolly Madison, and the staunch defenders of Fort McHenry, with great pride that our predecessors, against all the odds, were, for the second time in less than 40 years, able to take on the greatest Army and Navy at that time and win. But this pride should be tempered with the knowledge that, without the help of a just and righteous God, such victories would have never taken place. In recognition of these examples of divine intervention, let us always keep in our hearts and in our minds that passage from the book of Romans, wherein it is written, "If God is for us, who can stand against us?"
So it is Memorial Day weekend, and unfortunately for a lot of people, it's turned into the unofficial start of summer. And we don't recognize people that lost their lives in defense of our country or in service for our country. And for me, every Sunday is a Memorial Day because I'm here to remember what Christ did for us as well. So we have freedom in Christ and we have freedom in our country because of the sacrifices made. So, I lost my, here it is. So could I have the ushers please come forward for the morning offering?